Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Hello everyone, thank you for being there, and thank you for opening the Talk Genealogy podcast. We call it the monthly podcast for the genealogist with too much time on their hands. And in episode 48, I thought we'd chat about Admiral Sir John Hawkins and the design of Tudor farmhouses. What's that got to do with the price of fish, you may ask? Well, hang around and you may find out. I recently read a history of the Hawkins family in which the author, Michael Lewis, himself a descendant of the Admiral, showed us a knack for analysing sparse information which we may have about an ancestor, and if you like, making the most of it. I subsequently used the same technique to get me out of some muddled thinking around my Tudor family and their homes, and I'd like to share with you those lessons which I've learned. As I always do, I want to emphasize that I am neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast like you, who has spent more than 40 years digging up his family tree, not always in the right place. And these podcasts are really no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons which I've learned along the way. And I need to remind you that I am talking about ancestor hunting in England. Now, let's talk about this book. The author, Michael Lewis, who died in 1970, aged 80, was a professor of history at the Royal Naval College in Greenwich. His interest in the collation and preservation of maritime history was expressed through his energetic association with both the Navy Record Society and the Society for Nautical Research. On a popular level, though I didn't realise it at the time, he contributed to the British adaptation for the American television series Victory at Sea. I was an avid viewer back in my childhood. Victory at Sea is many years ago. Lewis's two most important books had him acting as editor rather than author. First, we'll mention Sir William Henry Dillon's memoirs, a narrative of my professional adventures, 1790 to 1839. Now, Dillon actually wrote this in manuscript before his death, obviously, but it wasn't printed or published. And so Michael Lewis got to grips with it and produced two very scholarly but entertaining volumes. He was also involved in the publication of Nelson's letters from the Leeward Islands and other original documents in the Public Records Office and British Museum. Now, this book was edited by Geoffrey Rawson, but it is Michael Lewis's annotations that make it especially am I going to say entertaining or interesting? Let's say both. It was published in 1953, and I'm afraid it was limited to 300 copies. And if you're desperate to acquire one of those copies, then there are at least a couple on the internet going for more than £500 each. Now, towards the end of his life, Lewis published two books which are of interest to family tree cultivators. In 1966, he wrote Ancestors, a personal exploration into the past. Lewis had quite notable ancestors, not just John Hawkins. And then there is the book that we're featuring in this episode, which is The Hawkins Dynasty, 3 Generations of a Tudor Family. And that originally came out in 1969 and is very easy to pick up a second-hand copy. Incidentally, my favourite of his books was published posthumously, and it's called Spithead, An Informal History. That came out in 1972, a special interest to me because I have connections, as you probably know, with Portsmouth.
You're listening to Talk Genealogy with Malcolm Noble.
Now, just a couple of housekeeping points. Since the last podcast, I have adopted a new domain name for the website, which is now, would you believe, talkgenealogy.com. Nice and simple. I've also taken the opportunity to refresh the website. You will also find, probably, my monthly blog on that website, although regular listeners will know that I am notoriously inefficient at maintaining a blog, but we'll give it a go. And finally, as I always do, if you are interested in this episode, I do recommend that you download it. I don't have any sort of paywall for Talk Genealogy. There's no private and special editions tucked around the back, which means that I really can't afford to maintain it on the net ad infinitum. So if it's of interest to you, please download it. Now, it is necessary to mention that John Hawkins was a fairly disreputable character in history. He was an early bird when it came to the Atlantic slave trade. He was in charge of 3 voyages across the Middle Passage. He was also a pirate, a privateer who at one time seems to have worked with, if not for, the Spanish government. But he was also an effective treasurer for the Elizabethan Navy. He redesigned the British warship, making it faster and more manoeuvrable. And when the Armada came, he was a member of the War Council and was actually third in charge of the country's defence. Now, I followed Hawkins' story since my childhood. My school class was designed into 4 teams: Nelson, Drake, Raleigh and Hawkins, and you can guess which one I was in. But I was attracted to Lewis's book, A Hawkins Dynasty, as it traced the family through 4 generations, through its parochial, though not impoverished, West Country beginnings to the English court and even diplomatic intrigue. When Lewis wanted to provide some character, some likeness, if you like, to the information he had about Hawkins, he turned inevitably to Charles Kingsley's classic Westward Ho. There, on the Plymouth Keys, we meet John Hawkins and his dad, and I'm going to read you that passage from Westward Ho. I'm sorry, I'm not going to attempt a Devonian accent because I couldn't even start, but here it is in my case of English. Burly, grizzled elder, in greasy, sea-stained garments contrasting oddly with the huge gold train about his neck, waddles up and he claps Drake on the back and with a broad Devon twang shouts, "Be you a coming to drink your wine, or be you not?" Lewis instinctively knew that this was a phony picture. He wrote, "Take that greasy stained garment. It will not do." When John Hawkins went to sea, we learn, he was known to take 50 changes of raiment with him, to dine in state in his own cabin, of silver and even gold plate. Or take that broad Devon twang. No, John Hawkins certainly dressed, wrote, and save perhaps for a mere accent, spoke like an Elizabethan gentleman, even if many of the gentry were not prepared to admit him to perfect and equal intimacy. And he goes on to conclude, Kingsley's cardinal blunder lies in picturing Sir John so very wrong. Moreover, it is sad, but probably true, that to many folk Kingsley's description or caricature remains the image of the man that exists in their mind. Now, it seems to me that Lewis had tapped into his thinking about the two personalities. Nothing here was new to him, by allowing the differences between Kingsley's caricature and the historical evidence to prompt his own questioning. It was the differences that triggered his thinking. Now, at the time, I was in something of a quandary of what to make of two 16th century wills. They were very welcome because they took one branch of my family tree back a further generation and identified a family in Cambridgeshire with a family in Kent. So that was great news. But I thought that these wills should be giving me something more. So I straightened out my thinking by using Lewis's technique. What were the differences between the two wills? Well, one was more carefully composed and certainly more carefully written. Perhaps I had thought that it had more to do with the scribe than the testator, but I made a note of it as something to question. Secondly, while the son, his will was written 50 years later, gave a record amount to his local church, the father gave smaller amounts but to several churches across the district. Now, remembering that such donations were actually an investment to ease a soul's passage through purgatory, I wonder if this said something about the father's business technique. Did he like to spread his bets? Now, the son spoke about a number of farms, the father only one. Now, clearly, the son was speaking of farm strips spread across the 5 fields in the parish. They worked the 3-field system, while the father was talking about either commonly held land or enclosed land, another line of inquiry. The son left 9 horses, the father only 1. The son left a number of carts and a number of ploughs, and he spoke about plough yards. Both had pigs, at least 1 cow, but the father left various numbers of sheep to anybody he could think of. At last, and it was by concentrating on the differences that caused the penny to drop, I realised that one was an arable farmer while the other was a sheep farmer. And now I was off and running, gathering up clues about how their year would have been different, their cash flow, even the different labour assigned to their children. And meal times, now there's a thing. And that treasure trove, if you like, was unlocked by examining the differences between the two wills. And we'll return to the discussion after this. And now we come to my recommendation of a video on YouTube and a website for you to visit. This month's choice of video has been posted a few months ago, so you may have come across it, but I only recently have done so. It's on the channel of History Calling, and it's headed "Can You Read Old Handwriting Styles?" It lasts for 33 minutes, and it is very informative and not a little entertaining. Now, there are many tutorials on the web for reading old handwriting, and this is not one of them. Okay, you're not going to learn how to read old handwriting from this video. What you are going to have is a general introduction, a few tips on the common mistakes to make, and it will increase your understanding of the different styles during the history. It starts with a Victorian example and then works its way back to Saxon times. Very well worth a look. That is, Can You Read Old Handwriting Styles on the History Calling channel. Moving on to the website, I want to mention the website Gazette Co UK. This is the website of the London Gazette, which is the official record of public notices. Now, very briefly, because the Gazette really deserves an episode to itself, don't confuse it with the British Gazette. The British Gazette was a publication published by Winston Churchill during the general strike of 1926. Not the same thing. The British Gazette is published weekly, and it gives you a statement of public notices. What is of interest to the genealogist is likely to be a record of the commissions and promotions in military service, the estate notices, that is the voluntary pasting of adverts in the Gazette by executors of wills to make sure that they have done due diligence in trying to find those folk who may have a claim. It's not a record of all wills, it is a voluntary record of those executors who've felt they want to be a bit careful and to publish it. Still, it is very useful. And then there is a record of insolvency and bankruptcy. So it is always worth punching in a surname and seeing what comes up. Now then, that is the brief overview, but the website has been developed over the past year and is tremendously informative, not a little educational, and very, very easy to navigate. So I do recommend that you go and explore it. It's thegazette.co.uk. Won't be a waste of time. Next month, I'll give you another video and a website to visit and explore. Let's go back to the episode. It was the buildings that I considered next. I decided to try the same approach and compared the wills of the son and the in-laws. Now, the in-laws, I think, were a little better off, but the families were certainly of the same class. They recognised themselves as yeomen rather than gentlemen, and certainly would not like to be called husbandmen. I therefore assumed that their farmhouses would be of conventional design. Now, I need your help now. Please imagine a letter H that has been sat upon, so that the uprights now are stumpy and the bridge is broader than our school teacher might prefer. Now pay attention, at this stage you need to push the H over, push it onto the ground. There we go, and you now have the layout of the building. Here we have the farmhouse design that endured for centuries. Yes, larger houses were based on similar designs, although they were greatly extended and added to, and more modest houses might have to make do with having some bits chopped off. But this was the conventional H design of the time. The bridge is the hall. It might be 2 stories high, that is to say it reached to the roof, or it might have been a gallery, but I have not come across a yeoman's house which had an upstairs hall, what we would call a landing. The hall doesn't seem to have had much furniture in it. Oh, by the way, our Tudor forebears didn't do clutter. Drapery? Well, we'll come to that later. Now, in one of the uprights of our H, I don't know why, but most drawings seem to put it to the right as we walk into the house. I'm sure there's no clear convention about that, but it seems to reoccur. This is the parlour, or the best room, the room that compares with the posh and little used front room of Victorian and Edwardian class homes, except that it may be that the master and mistress of the house slept in this room especially if there was no upstairs chamber. Guests, of course, would be entertained in the hall. Gradually, as we emerged from the Middle Ages, that hosting shifted from the hall to the parlour. This is called the decline of the hall. My guests at home would feel quite affronted if they got no further than my hallway. The choice furniture may be kept in the parlour. Silver, the same. Pewter, well, in at least one case, this was of the kitchen, but I think they mean the scullery rather than the kitchen. I suppose it depended on how much you trusted the hired help. Which brings us to the second upright of the H. Remembering that we have tipped the H over, so actually the uprights lay flat. This illustration is probably getting more complicated than it is worth. This was the service room, where the food may not have been cooked necessarily, but was prepared for cooking and later prepared for service. The smell was not for cultured nostrils, so an extra screen or even an extra wall separated this service room from the family in the hall. Depending upon your wherewithal, you would prefer the smelly and dirty cooking to be done in a kitchen out the back and brought into the home when the cooking was done. Like the laundry business, most laundry needing water was done outside at the time. The modern idea of eating in the same room as the cooking would have been considered as dirty as eating with the tools that you cut up your meat. You cut your meat and then you ate with your fingers. And no one would want to go to a toilet in your house. Now, would they? Upstairs there would be one or two, or very rarely for a yeoman, 3 chambers or bedchambers, with an important chest and a proper bed in at least one room. Now back to the comparisons of the two wills. This is between the son and his in-laws. What did I find? Basically, the woman's touch. While the first testator left farming implements, and he was most proud to leave the contents of his study, that means a library, as it stands now, to quote the terms, the in-laws' household was governed by a matriarch who had a wealth of blankets, sheets, coveralls, and drapes hanging on the wall, rather than curtains hanging at the window. Who would want to put an expensive curtain at a shuttered window without glass? It would get filthy and damp. And she also had treasured pots and pans. Interestingly, this household doubled up on the cooking gear. A puzzle I have yet to solve. Surely they wouldn't have had 2 kitchens. Given that clue, drawn by examining the difference between the wills, I began to look at how this matriarch may have influenced the family. Great fun and certainly rewarding. Most of the legacy, although not the land, was left to the girls in the family. Okay, I'm sure the chattels may have been subsumed into the husband's household and even became his property, but they were gifted to the daughters, granddaughters and nieces. My great time something grandma did very well out of her mother-in-law's death. So, in summary, if you want to get the most out of the little information that you may have about an ancestor, compare it with the information in a similar case and let the differences fire up your thinking. Why and when and how? And start asking the questions prompted by the differences that you recognise. I found this knack particularly helpful, and I hope that you do too. And that about finishes this month's episode. Episode 48 looked at John Hawkins and the design of Tudor farmhouses. The next episode will be posted on the 3rd Thursday of February. I hope you'll be there to open it up. In the meantime, this is Malcolm Noble saying thank you for listening and fare thee well.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.